by the way.
Yeah.
Cute.
Oh gosh, guys.
Okay, waiting for a few more people to join us and then we'll get started.
Pressure is on.
Laura's filling up fast.
Oh, Lord. Hi.
Hey, Rebecca.
Rebecca's there.
Hi, Rebecca.
Oh my God.
Oh.
Do we have somebody watching the chat just in case?
Yes, I will do that too.
Perfect.
Please.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Justin.
Please.
much.
Invite participation. Hello, everyone.
Are we muting first and then unmuting?
Correct.
All right. Well, I'd like to get started. So hello, everybody. My name is Justin Hannenberg, and I'll be the host for this session. During this session, please make sure to utilize the Q&A button to ask the questions to our presenters. You can also view the questions being asked by your fellow attendees, and you can upvote those that you find most valuable. The chat channel can be used to interact with your fellow attendees. However, again, please put all questions to the speakers in the Q&A. I'd like to get started by saying, welcome to today's session for ASCLS Leadership Academy presentations. The 2020 ASCLS Leadership Academy graduates will discuss how evolving the current ASCLS Off the Bench podcast can increase visibility and engagement for the medical laboratory science community. They will discuss the process of creating a podcast, explore the potential of obtaining CE credits to its listeners, and provide sustainability plan for future management. Please welcome me as we join, and please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Off the Bench is a podcast
created by ASCLS
that will discuss the scientific
and not so scientific ideas in laboratory medicine.
We are joined by members
Of ASCLS, fellow scientists,
educators, and researchers,
along with those interested in the profession.
We share ideas
and talk nerdy.
My name is Elinette Albino. I am from San Juan, Puerto Rico.
My name is Hosanna, and I'm from Austin, Texas.
My name is Crystal Austin, and I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana.
My name is Sophia Chandrasekhar, and I'm from Durham, North Carolina.
My name is Cliff Simrod, and I'm from Sterling, Virginia.
My name is Galina Dranova, and I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
My name is Billy Kettleson, and I am from Royal Oak, Michigan.
My name is Stephanie Moore, and I am from Sitka, Alaska.
My name is Jasmine Ponte, and I'm from Monterey, California.
My name is Cherika Robertson, and I am from Little Rock, Arkansas.
My name is Romy Seltzer, and I'm from Ferndale, Michigan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Off the Bench podcast. My name is Galina, and I will be one of your 11 presenters today. So as you can see in the photo in front of you, we had quite a big class. In fact, this is the largest ASCLS Leadership Academy class in history so far. Also marked by a strange fact that we only got to meet in person once, which was last year in Charlotte. And everything after that has been virtual. We have an amazing demographic and geographic distribution as well. As you just heard, we have people from Alaska all the way down to Puerto Rico. So we're really excited that we had the last year to spend and learn and grow with each other. So thank you to coronavirus. All of our project has been done virtually. So for about the last 6 months, we have been meeting about every 2 weeks to meet and hold each other accountable. And we're really excited to share with you our final product. Before we get started, I also would like to point out that if you've never heard of the Leadership Academy or don't know much about it, it is a year-long program with a series of classes, mentorship opportunities. We go to three conferences that are in person, and then of course this project. So lots of opportunity to learn about project management, communication, all of that. And I know classes start or applications open at the beginning of the year. So if you know somebody, if you are interested in joining, there's more information on the ASCLS website. So without further ado, let's talk about what our group was up to for the last year. Before we get started, a quick poll for everyone. Do you currently listen to any type of podcast? All right. It's a pretty quick question. So if you have that poll up in front of you, just a couple more seconds, and we'll see what the results are.
Sorry, I'm having a hard time pulling it up.
There it is. All right. Ooh, excellent. All right, so 60% of you have listened to a podcast before, 40% of you have not. Okay, just to give you an idea of the popularity and where this poll kind of fit, Edison Research Group actually puts out an annual survey where they look at different forms of social media, including podcasts. And so in 2017, when asked this question, 40% of Americans aged 12 and up listen to podcasts. So 40%, that's already a pretty darn big number. 2020, the same poll is repeated, and now that number is up to 55%. So in 3 years, we have seen a 15% increase in the people who are aware and listen to podcasts. It's different than subscriptions, but just this statistic itself is compelling enough to investigate how do we harness this to benefit our profession. So really when we were looking at the project and starting out, we really focused on the why, not the how, because first of all, let me tell you, we had no background in creating a podcast. This was all brand new to us, but you don't need a plan in order to have a vision, right? So we first focused on the why. Why would we provide a benefit to our community? And really where we started was in-person conference attendance. And really we identified there are many barriers to attending an in-person conference, some of which are listed above. So first, we'll look at rising travel costs, then a management approval for a multi-day conference, right? So you might have the funding, your management might really want you to go to a conference, but there simply may not be the capacity to let you go off bench for 3-4 days, travel across the country, right? And if they say, no, I'm sorry, we can't approve you for this conference, but you can use your personal PTO to go. Well, that poses a pretty big cost-benefit analysis for a person, because now they're having to decide, do I take a week off to go visit my family in California, or do I take a week off and go, to a wonderful national conference? It still poses a little bit of a challenge. And last but not least, if asked, I would say that a large population of medical lab professionals would consider themselves pretty introverted, right? And so if you're asking someone to pay money, take PTO, and then go to a conference across the country where you're in a room of 100-some people that you've never met, they might choose a virtual opportunity instead, right? So what we've seen in the last few years, and actually for a while now, is that there's this hybrid model of virtual and physical events, and that's really the future. And in fact, this already takes place across other healthcare professions. We see this for physicians, for nurses, for speech therapists. There are already CE-based podcasts. In other words, I'm going to listen to something and it's going to earn me CE credit for my recertification, right? If anyone here has heard of ZDog MD, his podcast and YouTube channel, those are also able to be approved for CE credit. So that's just a really big example. Mayo has one. Like I said, speech therapy PD. There's already all of these other examples of how different professions are harnessing podcasts to earn continuing education credit. And then, of course, additionally, if we have a podcast that will allow for CEs, then you've now freed up time for your tech to be cleaning their kitchen, driving to the cabin, whatever it is they want to be doing, while at the same time learning. We hope that additionally, this will provide an additional service perk to members of ASCLS community. And we'll talk about how we're hoping that this is going to increase engagement, and you'll see that in later slides. And finally, a diverse community should have diverse methods of engagement. Okay, so we answered the why. And now we really had to get to the how. Okay, once again, we had no background on how to create a podcast. So what we did is we created a project tracker document, and out of it, it included timelines, objectives, what our deliverables and challenges were going to be. And out of that, we came up with a scope statement to increase organizational value by developing a series of free to listen, interview-based, educational podcast episodes that may provide listeners with PACE-approved CE credit. Okay, with that, we added some measurable goals. We're going to increase visibility of the ASCLS organization by recording at least 6 podcasts. That was our primary goal. We also had an alternate goal of, hey, if we understand that we're all dealing with COVID-related changes to our respective facilities that we work on. So if we can't do 6, can we do 3? That was our alternate goal. And if we can't do 3, what's our contingency plan? So we said, even if we make 1 podcast, get it approved for CE credit and provide all the tools for future, then we've done well, all things considered, okay? So secondly, it was to create marketing strategies to improve podcast viewership and ASCLS engagement. That's pretty easy to measure too, because we now can pull metrics on podcast subscriptions, et cetera, and how much traffic we're getting to our podcast website. Last but not least, we wanted to develop tools for future success and sustainability of the podcast. In other words, what standard operating procedures can we leave behind for future years? And how do we make sure that this isn't something that we do and then no one ever does again, right? Because that sustainability is key. And once we came up with all the goals, the first decision that we had to make was, do we create a brand new podcast? They're 1-hour-long episodes, interview-based, we get CE and make those PACE approved, or do we use a platform that already exists? I don't know if how many of you have heard, but ASCLS has their own podcast called Off the Bench. Can we work with them in order to create our podcast and merge it into what they're already doing? So after meeting with the creators of the podcast, we decided that the best route was to create a collaborative effort and for us to join forces and add to something that's already been built, because they have the platform, they have the website, they have the following, and we are going to add value to that following. Right, so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jasmine, talking about where currently the Off the Bench podcast is.
Jasmine, you're muted.
Oh, okay. Hi, sorry for that. So to solidify the question of why creating a podcast and how creating a podcast, we wanted to talk to the originals, right? The OGs of the ASCLS Off the Bench podcast. They have a lot of tools that we can learn from them. And the creators of this Off the Bench podcast is Lindsay Davenport Landry, Samantha Somm, and Julia O'Donnell. So some of the questions we asked, how many podcasts have you guys made? And since February 2019, they've made 8. Another question we asked, how do you promote your podcast? One obvious one is the ASCLS website, social media, which in this case, Facebook, and the ASCLS Society News Now e-newsletter. How many downloads have you guys gotten on these podcasts? 1,100, which is really amazing. Just learning about doing podcasts. And subscriptions since March and April of this year, they've had 27 subscribers on Apple Podcast alone. And you can see here, there's icons of where these podcasts are available besides the ASCLS website. There's Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, which I mentioned, and Google Play Music. And some of these I've never actually heard of. So as a learner, and many of us in the group, this is like, oh my gosh, where can we go with this information? So continuing on. However, there are challenges, right? As a group working remotely. And one of them is time and the energy to devote the work to the voluntary-based podcast. Where can we find the time especially as scientists, we do multiple things in our life. We have families, we work full time. So how and when and how, things change during the life, especially with COVID that happened this year. Second, an inconsistent publication schedule, having the challenge to create a defined schedule, maybe a few months out, 6 months out, which my colleagues will talk about later in the toolkit. And lastly, the competition with other podcasts. Again, like Alina was saying in the previous slides, podcasts are like the hot thing right now. There's so many podcasts out there. How do we stand out? And so we're going on. There should be a poll, or before we go through the poll, so we wanted to ask more questions among our colleagues and among our peers. So you want to hear the community interest, go a little bit further, ask further questions. One of the polls that we asked was through the Facebook group. Maybe many of you are part of this, the Medical Laboratory Scientists Facebook group, and even among our peers. And second, we also asked some questions among our ASCLS community in the open forum and through the email. So here we have a poll. There's 2 questions, very simple. So the first question, would you listen to a CE-based podcast for MLS? Answer yes or no. And then we'll have another question. Are you an ASCLS member? Yes or no. All right, probably a few more seconds. Yes, that's awesome, 90%. I love this. All right, that is awesome. Great. So I'll go a little bit further about this question or these questions when we ask the Facebook group. So you'll see here a simple bar graph. Facebook poll was the same question. So we asked 67 participants total for the Facebook poll, and 43% yes, they are interested in CE-based podcasts, whether it's scientific or not, and yes, they are members. 25% said yes, they are interested, but no, they're not a member. And 22% no, they preferred CE online, and no, they're not members. On the low end, 3% said no, not interested in podcasts, and no, they're not members. So if you look at this graphic, kind of before we go to that, these answers kind of converge with the times, right? With COVID, we are not, in-person CE courses are not as popular now. You have to go working remotely. And as scientists as well, we're always on the go. We can listen to the podcast on the road or even at our home, just like we were doing right now with our virtual conference. Next question. So the following questions will talk about the survey that I asked among the ASCLS community. So the first question, currently, how do you obtain or hear about CE courses? 67% said email, 51% said from their work or employer, around the same amount, 47%, ASCLS website. On the low end, mail, 18%. So it sounds like paper is not very popular, more so mail is popular for Amazon packages. And other, they had the option to state where else where they hear about CE courses is through Media Lab, Journal, or other professional organizations. I should also mention our participants had the option to pick more than one. So this is not 100% going off 100%. And the total number of participants for this survey was a total of 89 participants. Question 2. Through which of the following formats do you prefer to learn and obtain continuing education, also known as PACE? 63% live webinars, just like here. Online courses, 60%. In person, 53%. However, this may change in the future. And podcasts, 41%. That is pretty alarming. So we have a potential here to gravitate to that podcast. Other Participants mentioned ASCP online courses. Question 3. When you want to learn about scientific or not so scientific topics, which tone do you appreciate? This is an important question because it helps us as a group when we are creating our podcast. How do we want to sound to our listeners? Whether it's our peers or the world, really. And the question, you can see in this graph, majority of them wanted to hear something that was informative, friendly, educational, which is also the same as informative. Humorous, yes, but not as much, not so serious. Other participants mentioned they wanted information that was direct. Question 5, if podcasts could be utilized for CE, what would be the best way to promote them to ASCLS members? And you can see here, ASCLS website was very popular, email subscription, and social media, which would be Facebook. On the low end, again, mail, not so much. If podcasts could be utilized for CE, what would be the best way to promote them to non-ASCLS members? So this is pertaining to potential members or not. One popular one that stands out is social media without requiring them to get the ASCLS membership. And here as well, email without asking for requirement of the membership, which is about 25-30%. So to sum up the results here from our community interests, from Facebook, from our peers, from our colleagues, I found 3 things that stood out. So the marketing platform, as members, what do they prefer? Or what do they receive? Email, ASCLS website, and social media, particularly Facebook. And non-members, what would be the best way to reach them? Social media via Facebook. And I'm learning maybe Twitter as well. I was looking at that previous presentation a few days ago, and email. The tone, what would be the tone that we want to project on our podcast? Informative and friendly. And the learning format of obtaining CE courses, the ones that were very popular were the live webinars in person, which might not be so true anymore, and podcasts. There we go.
So after consulting with the board of directors, ASCLS board of directors, and getting some very positive feedback from them, we went ahead and decided to do the podcast project. So first thing we had to do is divide the work into pre-production, production, and post-production in order to mainstream the process. So for the pre-production, we decided on 2 types of podcasts. The first one was CE-based podcast, which will be the majority of the podcasts we were going to do. And in order to do the CE-based podcast, we needed to identify speakers. In order to find them, we thought of previous experiences at different meetings, be it state, be it nationals, and identify some engaging, highly rated speakers for expert interview in live-related topics. Then we came up with a letter in order to approach those speakers, where we introduced ourselves, we explained about what our project is, and at this time, financial compensation was not offered, but everyone was very enthusiastic of being part of it and helped us out anyway. And since our goal for these podcasts was to be able to offer those CE credits, we had to make sure that proper research was done and that we had at least an hour of recorded content, and that way we could be confident that we'd be able to meet the PACE requirements. Next one. The second type of podcast we identified was what we decided to call recalibration podcast. For this kind of podcasts, which are slightly different or very, very different, we decided that they were going to be fun. So we were not as selective for the speakers. We decided on 1 or 2 a year, no more than that, where lab professionals find clips from TV, from movies, or relevant stories where they react and, in essence, debunk how the lab is depicted in popular culture. Every episode has a theme that we agree ahead of time, and listeners are encouraged to participate by submitting clips for future episodes. And of course, since these episodes are to take a breather from the CE-based podcast and engage the audience, no CE would be offered at this time for this kind of podcast. So for pre-production, there is some homework that needs to be done. So now you have your speaker, you have your topic, and you're all set to record your podcast. What do you do next? First thing that you do is prepare an outline. You want to know the flow and have the right questions to ask your speaker. We came up with a general outline, so the introduction and the closing remarks are consistent on all podcasts, but the content itself is up to the host. I highly recommend fitting in at least one rehearsal with your speaker, so you're both ready and comfortable. You should pick a quiet place that has low reverb or echo. So avoid empty spaces, corners, rooms that don't have much around you. Next, you want to make sure that your equipment, your microphone, your headphones, your phone, your computer, whatever you're going to use to do your podcast is functional and there's no problems. So you know that the day of the recording, you're good to go. Have at least those 60 minutes of content before you're edited in order to make sure that there is enough content and you are going to be okay for your pace requirements. And lastly, just relax. Enjoy the process. You got this.
Okay, so production. There are two main types of recording software that we utilize. The first one is Zoom, and we're all very, very familiar with Zoom at this point. It's a program that, obviously we're using now. It's free for 40 minutes, or you may need to contact ASCLS or whoever has a paid account to have an unlimited amount of time for your podcast. It allows for an unlimited amount of speakers, but you do have to download the program to your computer and make sure your interviewee also has the program on their computer. You can record the session, and when you record it, it'll save the audio file separately. When it's done, you can go to the Zoom folder and make sure to click to convert the file to MP3 files. You can also record the audio files per speaker, but it's not intuitive because we actually didn't know that until 2 days ago. So we used a different software. The software that we use is actually Zencastr, and it's actually really great because it's completely web-based, so you don't have to download anything. It's currently free it's always free for 2 speakers, although right now during COVID, they're saying it's free for unlimited speakers for unlimited amount of time. Whenever that's over, it is $18 per month on a yearly basis. Again, because there is no special download required, it is a web-based application. It's really easy for you to set up with your interviewee. All they need is just a link to the actual session. They click on it and you're bada bing, bada boom, you're done, you're in. The nice thing about Zencastr that we liked was that it automatically saved separate audio files per speaker. So it's extremely, extremely user-friendly. And I tested this at home with multiple computers, multiple mics and connections. The audio quality, for some reason, just sounds way better than Zoom. You sound a lot cleaner, a lot warmer, a lot richer, and less crackly and nasally. For editing, there's a lot of software out there, but there's 2 main ones that are utilized for our CE podcasts. The first one is Audacity. Audacity is free, but because it's free, it's also a bit of a clunky workhorse. So it takes a lot more clicks to get anywhere to do anything. Yes, you can download presets made by other people, but again, you get what you pay for, which is nothing, so you got to do more work on your end. Audition, on the other hand, is an Adobe-based software. I personally already pay for Adobe for all my art stuff and everything else I do outside of ASCLS and work. So I also have access to Adobe Audition. If you are a faculty member at a university or have access to university software, you may also be able to download it from there as well. I like Audition more because it's slick and it's extremely powerful. It has a very, very strong processing. Like, it has amazing code. It's really, really great. I recommend it. So post-production. Once you finish recording, it's time for your post-production. And the first thing you have to do is actually send the audio files to whoever the assigned editor is, unless it's you, which in the case was me. So what did I do? I brought the audio files into my computer, and basically I followed a general guideline for editing podcasts and editing software. And it's essentially, I did write up an SOP for this, but it's an overview, or it's a workflow that I personally utilize. Adjust what you need for your workflow. I'll go into detail about editing more in a bit, but again, you can check our SOP in our toolkit if you want to. After you're done editing, you send your completed podcast to your group for approval. Make sure everything sounds good, nothing needs to be adjusted, volume sounds great, all that good stuff. And then once that's good, send the podcast and whatever PACE required items to the PACE committee for approval. This is again for the CE podcasts. If it's a non-CE podcast, like a recalibration episode, we then move on to the next step. When it's everything good and ready to go, it's time to publish and promote. So make sure you send your general description, your keywords, your PACE required documentation, whatever else you need, hashtags, everything, to whoever is in charge at this point, which is the ASCLS Director of Marketing Communications, which is in this case, the amazing Julia O'Donnell. So make sure to utilize your friends for your group and your friends to help promote your podcast, this podcast, the Off the Bench podcast, on social media and within the Connect community. So this is my general overview of my workflow for editing. So the first thing you want to do is to import your audio into your software. If your audio is in Zoom, make sure you convert it in the computer first. Once you've imported it, do anything you need to do to help you identify it. I personally rename all my audio files with just speaker names, just so I know who I'm editing at the time. And then before you start cutting up your audio file, clean it up and enhance your sounds. And between both Audacity and Audition, both have a lot of effects that you can use to help make any audio file sound amazing. The first thing I always do is noise reduction. And what it does is basically the name. It's a process of removing noise from a signal. Find a quiet or a flat part in your audio clip, select that as your pattern, and then apply that pattern over your entire audio clip. What that does is the computer or whatever software you use is going to eliminate those signals, those patterns from that quiet portion and eliminate from your entire audio clips. So what that does is it helps, take out the sound of your computer fan, take out the sound of your AC, and maybe a 2-year-old with a very large lungs 2 rooms over, which, I mean, that's a bit of a stretch, but it can do some of that. And then next effect you should probably try is equalize, normalize, or compress. And whether or not you actually need to do this, it's up to the quality of the audio. If it sounds great and you think it's good to go, don't mess with it. I think I had a couple audio files I didn't even touch because they sounded fantastic. So equalize, what does equalize do? Equalize basically adjusts the frequency or the tone to reach your desired sound quality. So you can adjust it to make it sound less tinny and more warm. Normalize, this increases your overall volume by taking your highest peaks and setting it to your 0 decibels. So it can increase or lower depending on the person, like how close they are to the mic. But the problem with this is that if it takes your highest peaks and sets it to your norm or the 0 decibels, if it lowers it or raises up, it can also take your lower peaks and make it way too quiet as well. So that's what compression's for. Compression can take your higher peaks and compress them down to your quieter volume or your more average volume. So that way everything sounds more compressed but equal all around. So you don't have sudden high sounds and low sounds. Also, I talk with my arms, I'm sorry. All right, so next point is boost bass or boosting your decibels. Depending on the audio equipment of you or your speakers, you may find that some of the voices don't sound quite right. A lot of mics, unless they're built for it, have a harder time picking up either end of the audio spectrum. So specifically bass. Boost your bass in your speakers, especially those that have more bass in their voices, like males. I actually have a mic that my husband and I chose specifically because after doing multiple tests from different YouTubers, it actually had the most bass pickup. So if you don't have that mic, some audio and editing is great in that you can boost that bass back up. And some audio, like Adobe Audition, for example, has something where they can enhance male voices. So that actually does that for you automatically. But sometimes it's good to go in there and just manually adjust it yourself so it sounds more like someone else that you actually know. And after all that, if everything is still too quiet, crank those decibels, that volume level a little bit higher just so you can hear it. If it's too loud, turn that back down. Edit as you listen. Don't sit and listen to your raw files a full time before editing. I personally recommend listening and editing as you go, because as you're listening, you know right then and there that an edit needs to be made. Once you've made that cut, that volume reduction, whatever you need to do, go back a couple of seconds and make sure your edit is exactly where you want it to sound like, and then you can keep going and listen to the rest of the stuff. Then we add the intro and the outro. So adjust your fades and your audio volume accordingly, and of your music and your speakers. So as you heard in our introduction, we had that really awesome music, our little introduction music playing, and then it dropped down to more background level, and it was playing in the background as all of our speakers were just, talking, so that we can still hear it, but it's not overpowering, like a good background music should. Then once that's all done, export and save it as an MP3, and then send it to your group for checking and feedback.
So as Galina mentioned earlier, there are several professional organizations that already offer podcasts for continuing education credits. In my research, I was unable to find one that was laboratory specific for the laboratory profession. So one of the goals of the Leadership Academy class of 20 was to create podcasts that are continuing education opportunities for laboratory professionals. So once the podcast is created, edited, and it's ready for publishing, the next step is to obtain PACE approval so that listeners are able to obtain this continuing education credit. And if any of you guys have ever been involved in obtaining PACE approval for a live educational session at national, state, regional meetings, the process is very similar. So what we had to do, once the speaker was determined, we had to get the speaker to complete the PACE speaker form. We wanted to make sure that the speaker was valid, obtain the speaker's information, a short biography, and definitely identify any conflict of interest, as well as obtain a description of the podcast and list the 3 learning objectives of these podcasts. And one thing that we learned in this process is that these objectives must be measurable. So after listening to the podcast, we want to make sure that we achieve all of our objectives, as well as the level of instruction for the podcast. Is it basic, intermediate, or advanced? And then as well as the podcast length. The podcast length plays a huge role in determining how many continuing education credits the podcast will be worth. So once you have your form completed, this form will go to the ASCLS PACE director. Our group worked very closely with Andrea Hickey, so a big shout out to her for answering our many questions. And then Andrea will work with the PACE committee as well to get final approval from the PACE so that listeners are able to achieve continuing education credit. So once the listener listens to the podcast, and I want to note here that in order for the listener to achieve continuing education credit, the podcast must be listened to in its entirety. Once the podcast is completed, a 5 post-test question will become available, and these 5 questions include content specific. So the questions will be related to information that was delivered during the podcast. Once those 5 questions are answered, another short 4-question survey will open up as well. And that survey basically asks, did the learning objectives meet? How was the speaker? Those types of questions that we are all used to completing after an educational session. And so once that short 4-question survey is completed, the listener will receive a completion certificate. Now, it's important to note that on that completion certificate, there will be a special CE code that we have all been getting as we've been listening to the sessions during this meeting. And then that code can be entered into your CE organizer for linking to your ASCP certification. So listeners are able to obtain credit that way. It is important to note that once the listener finishes the podcast and completes that survey, they have 45 days to enter that special code into CE Organizer. And then that will allow the listener to obtain the appropriate credit.
So you've put in all that work. You did all your pre-homework, you did all your production, you stepped out of your comfort zone potentially to actually record your podcast. You got with your editing team or did it yourself. And now you want to get it out there and you want to make sure that everybody can actually see it. So we had to come up with a marketing strategy that would help allow our podcast and every podcast for Off the Bench to get out there to our members and non-members alike. So earlier we mentioned how we had kind of an inconsistent publishing schedule in the past. And what that did was it didn't allow subscription algorithms to keep up with your current subscription. So you weren't always getting notified when a new episode was out. So we looked at monthly releases to allow that algorithm to keep up. This would allow you to get notification when a new one came out, but it would also allow us the ability to create a backlog of episodes through Leadership Academy and Off the Bench that we could release every month. This will allow us to interspace those CE episodes that Romy was talking about, along with those recalibration or just general interview episodes. You could do just about any kind of podcast and get it out there. We just wanted to keep up with that monthly schedule, so we knew what was going on. So then we had to promote it. We got to get it out there. How do we do that? ASCLS website and the Connect community. That is our main avenue for promoting to ASCLS members. So we definitely want to keep that up, as well as all our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Reddit, all those good things. We wanted to leverage our huge social media contributors and those big influencers who could get stuff out there really well throughout social media to help us promote it across all of those platforms. So moving forward, how do we move forward with this marketing strategy and all the work we've put in so far and that will continue to be put in? We want to increase the number of subscribers to the podcast. 27 is a great number off Apple Podcasts, but we want to help make it better. We want to turn a free perk into a profit potentially for ASCLS. Throughout these podcasts, we could have the ability to get sponsors or advertisers at a fee, which would then go back to ASCLS so we can help create a profit. And then the podcast itself for CE would be free to members only, with the nominal fee, kind of like we do for our monthly webinars, would be a fee for non-members if they would like to listen and get the CE credit offered. And we need your help and everybody's help to spread the word. Become a speaker. If you think you want to speak about something, let us know. Suggest a topic. We are always, and everyone's looking out for topics to talk about. You kind of run out of ideas after a while when you make multiple podcasts. And don't forget to share us on social media. Get the word out there, share left and right, and hopefully we'll bring more people along. So the next part of what we kind of did is we had to talk about sustainability. So we broke sustainability down into 4 sections: members, design, timeline, and tasks.
Podcasts for Leadership Academy will be maintained and sustained by current Leadership Academy members along with the prior year's Leadership Academy graduates. In the event that there is not a current year for the Leadership Academy, sustainability will fall to the prior year's graduating class, as well as any ASCLS member volunteers. These volunteers for interviewing and interviewees will also be solicited at the annual ASCLS conference.
We designed the podcast sustainability so that the current Leadership Academy participants will work hand in hand with prior year's Leadership Academy graduates, beginning at the first meeting of the current year Leadership Academy participants. The prior year's Leadership Academy graduates will introduce the Leadership Academy podcast project. The information will include templates of identifying topics and speakers, pre-production, production, post-production, and sustainability. Prior year's Leadership Academy graduates will provide guidance and support to help produce the first podcast, after which time the Leadership Academy podcast production will be overtaken by current year Leadership Academy participants.
The timeline for the podcasts involves the completed podcasts being created during the current year's Leadership Academy, and then publishing them the year following the Leadership Academy's graduation. In this way, all podcasts will be created a year in advance to allow time for the current Leadership Academy to learn the process and produce them. There will be a minimum of 4 podcasts per year, but ideally would go up to 12 podcasts per year. This is in addition to the 6 to 8 podcasts that Off the Bench normally produces, which is separate from the Leadership Academy. So ideally, there will be 1 podcast each month. The graduating class will help the new class create their first podcast within the first 2 months of their first meeting at the annual conference, which means starting now. The podcast will be published the last Friday of each month for consistency.
We have an interest in connecting with our lab community more. So, and that's why the questions from our listeners are very important. These questions should be submitted for future podcasts 2 months out. And this is maintained by the current year Leadership Academy. For tips on how to create questions, we develop a toolkit. So please refer to our toolkit.
All right. So now to the part that many of you have probably been waiting for. What are our deliverables? Were we able to meet our goal? And I'm happy to share with you the following table that yes, we were able. Remember, one of our goals was to create 6 podcasts. So here you'll see a table. We have 4 categories of what's ready to publish, what's currently in pace review, what is in the editing process, and what is scheduled. So we have 2 podcasts that are ready to publish. The first one is talking about acute myeloid leukemia workup management and prognosis with Dr. John McClure. So you'll see an example of that that's hyperlinked because it is actually a website that's already built. And just waiting to publish on a schedule. We also have a recalibration podcast that is ready to publish as well, called Cringeworthy Lab TV Moments Podcast. All right. And then 2 that are in pace review, one about legislative insights, one about zoonotic diseases. In editing, we have caring for transgender patients and patient advocacy. And the 2 podcasts that we actually have scheduled to record in July is Genetic Roles of Genetic Counselors in Clinical Lab and Personalizing Treatment Options of Clinical Genomics. So as you can see here, the topics are very well rounded and hopefully will reach the interest of many listeners. What does this look like? This is our first podcast that is now PACE approved and ready to publish, the acute myeloid leukemia one. On the website, you will see all PACE required documentation, including the description, learning objectives. You'll also see a bio on the speaker, the level of instruction, and any references pertaining to the podcast. Probably the most exciting part that I want to share with you is, first of all, the top section here is how you obtain your CE credits. Once again, you have to listen to the entire podcast. Then you have to complete an evaluation about the podcast. And last, you have to complete a survey questions or test assessment questions in order to get your certificate. And at the bottom half, this is where the engagement comes in, because once again, we want to keep our community active. You can join the discussion by either putting comments down there or asking questions from the speaker. The idea is, as you're listening to whatever it is we're discussing, you might have additional questions that then we as hosts can bring back to the speaker. And maybe down the line in the future, if there's enough questions, if there's enough interest, we create an entire podcast episode where we just go in and answer the questions that you've asked. So hopefully the conversation doesn't end with you just listening to a podcast, regurgitating it on a test, and just forgetting it. It hopefully continues the conversation.
The toolkit is a complete collection of all of our SOPs involved in creating our podcasts and represents our major contribution to ASCLS that the Leadership Academy is providing. The toolkit is comprised of sections on pre-production, questions, pitch email, soliciting speakers, production, which involves creating the podcast, post-production, editing and publishing, continuing education, social media marketing, and keeping it going in perpetuity.
So now that you know about all of the exciting upcoming podcasts that are scheduled, I bet your burning question is, how can I access these podcasts? So the podcast will be available on the ASCLS website. So you can simply go to ascls.org. Along the top banner there under communication, you will see podcast. Once you click on podcast, the links for each of the podcasts that we have mentioned, plus the other Off the Bench podcast, will be accessible here as well. So to solidify that we have a lot of unfinished business here, it doesn't end here on this project. Not a happy ending, but more of where can we go? What else can we do? So you remember the surveys that we presented earlier. There is a lot of questions we may have and would like to follow up and keep our listeners engaged, our potential listeners, and our peers out there. And a few of the things that we may ask in the future, as we are still going to meet after this project is over, what are your interests? What topics do you want to hear? You may have said this over and over. Do you know of any speakers? Are you a potential speaker? Again, our podcasts are open to anyone. It doesn't have to necessarily be PACE approved. We have our recalibration podcast. And collaborators, is there anyone that wants to join in the conversation? I see a lot of people in the chat would love some coffee. Join in a coffee break. I'm so down. Let's do it. And lastly, we want to hear your feedback about the podcast quality as well. Is there anything that we could do better? Any questions you want answered? Should we do a follow-up survey or a follow-up podcast to a podcast we already had? So it doesn't end here. And lastly, as a group, if everybody wants to join me, we want to say thank you. Thank you to our mentors in the Leadership Academy. Can you believe it's been a year? Like, oh my gosh. Especially to Rebecca Rogers. She's been with us the entire time, even though we only met one time in person in the last ASCLS Jam conference, and virtually from there. She's been through us, making sure that we need what we need or have what we need in our constant virtual meetings. We want to thank Lindsay. Thank you so much for being our mentor in starting the podcast, as many of us are very new. I could say in my experience doing a podcast, I didn't know I didn't expect to do one, but we did it. I did it. Awesome. Samantha Som, Andrea Hickey, thank you so much for being a great tool for us in Source as well, for the possibility of these podcasts being PACE credit, and to Julia O'Donnell as well for being a mentor in marketing, communications, and anything tech savvy. And to Justin, shout out to you, moderator. Thank you for leading us to what of it? It's 11 of us in this whole presentation. It was awesome. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you to all of the Leadership Academy. This has been an amazing session. I feel so inspired. I'm just filled with ideas. You have a great energy. The chat box has been blowing up from everything that you've had to say. So let's congratulate this year's Leadership Academy graduates and thank them for a great presentation. So awesome. Just keep it rolling, keep it rolling. I'm loving reading this. So thank you so much again to everyone for joining. And we look forward to you. Coming up right after this is our closing keynote session. Please stick around. All right. We have no other questions though. So any questions that have come in were answered in the chat. Feel free to take a look, and thank you again. Congratulations are still coming in.